And we believe writing is an important component of your graduate education experience. The graduate school has an opportunity to award graduate research grants to graduate students. And we have a committee, a Graduate Council Research Committee, that reviews these grant applications. We are fortunate to have Dr. Sarah Oakes, the chair of the Graduate Council Research Committee, who has helped for the past year as a committee member in reviewing grants, and her insight will be very helpful for each of you to submit high quality grants. So before we begin, Ms. Birchfield has a poll for you, just to get a pulse if you have any writing skills. Laura? Question's fairly simple. Have you written a research grant before? Just to get an idea. Wonderful. So we have about 7 of you do not have experience, whereas 4 of you have experience. So you've come to the right place. For those of you who have written as well, there's always some tips Dr. Oakes will share with you. So I'll advance the slides on behalf of Dr. Sarah Oakes. So the information in this PowerPoint presentation is taken from the link that is at the bottom of this slide, and it is www.wku.edu/graduate/aid/research grant. And so again, the purpose of this research grant is to allow you to contribute to new knowledge and help you in submission of a high quality thesis. And we are fortunate to have a committee of faculty from multiple disciplines help us review these grants. There are 2 deadlines, one for fall and one for spring. The deadline for fall is October the 11th, and we have sent emails to all the graduate students. For the spring deadline, we will consult with the Graduate Council Research Committee and announce at an opportune time. Now, this is the application. I'll defer to Dr. Sarah Oakes to provide sage advice to all of you.
Why, thank you. So I'm excited to spend a little time with you all today and talk a little bit about this process. I am fortunate to have been able to serve on this committee for the 3 years prior, and then for this upcoming year, I'm able to chair the committee. So I will say that you can be confident that the faculty serving on the committee are invested in student work, excited to be reviewing student work and student projects, and love this part of their job. So it's definitely a place that you'll get some really good support and some feedback. So again, you can find this information on the website, but if you don't have previous experience with grant submissions, it might be helpful to just talk through what these components are, what they look like. And then please, as we're talking through this, let us know if you have questions. If you can't access something, if I'm saying a word that doesn't make sense to you, not explaining something well, please just stop us along the way. And so the first thing to know is that all materials will be sent to that address there. So that grad student research grant at wku.edu. Everything has to be submitted to that email address in order to be considered for review. And then the actual components of our application. So we have a research application form, and we can look at that, the actual form. It might be helpful for you to see. Thank you. And so on this form, the graduate school has done a wonderful job in making it pretty intuitive, pretty user-friendly. But of course, you'll complete all necessary components: your name, ID number. Some parts that I want to point out. So you will have to provide real initials or real signatures. And what I mean by that is either your printed, handwritten signatures, or your actual signature with an Adobe or the digital Adobe sign. but you can't just type in a cursive font someone's signature. So we will need real authentic signatures. And those signatures will have to come from you as the student submitting the grant, as well as your direct research advisor, your research representative at the college, which is, sorry, your department head first, and then your research representative at the college. And then the other part of this form, so this form includes all of the components of your application as well, which is very helpful. And we'll talk through the budget in a little bit. The other thing that I want to note from this form, if you don't mind scrolling to the second page, I believe there's an additional, yes. So it's helpful, of course, to tell us who else has contributed to the project. And then am I accurate that there's a third page to this document? No, okay, that'll live someplace else. But this is sort of, you can think of it almost as the cover page to the rest of your application materials, because it has on that front facing page all of the components that are required and the signatures that are required as well. So we can go back to the PowerPoint to keep talking through the individual components. Thank you for doing the hard work, Dr. Kudali. Thank you. So we went through the signatures, all of those things that are required. And then now we'll talk a little bit about your budget. The graduate school provides a lot of helpful guidance that you can find at this link in terms of what's accepted, what's not accepted, or allowable or fundable expenses. And while those are coming up, it's helpful to consult with your research advisor to think through what you need or what would be helpful to conduct your research. We commonly have requests for travel, supporting travel to conduct research. So whether that's in-field data collection, participant incentives is another common budget item. So you want to incentivize or participants for participating in your studies, or participants for traveling to get to study or data collection. I'm trying to think of other common budget types that we have. Oh, certainly the purchase of software or hardware that is essential to your project. So things like that the school doesn't already have. So there might be a specific software that's necessary to complete a portion of your project. Within Ogden, we get a lot of requests for actual materials, right? So chemicals, solvents, those items. And it's helpful to be really as specific and detailed as you can in your budget so that we can most accurately evaluate it. So that means that if you are purchasing something, you should have found the actual item and the actual cost of that item and filled out that specific up to the dollars and cents, what the specific cost is per each individual item. And then of course, how many you would need of each item. Similarly for travel related expenses, we use federal guidance. And so you could easily Google and find those or ask the graduate school for that website, but there's a certain rate a certain rate that you can charge in terms of travel, mileage, et cetera. And so those really do need to be very specific and very detailed so that we can make the most accurate assessment. And then in addition to that budget piece, you will also fill out a budget narrative that describes the need for each of those budget items. So how does that thing that you're requesting contribute to the completion of your project? Why is it necessary to complete your project? Any questions so far? That's a great question, Dakota. So Dakota's asking in the chat, if your project costs exceed what you're requesting, you should still indicate that, and there's a space to do so on the budget form that we'll hopefully be able to pull up at some point. The budget form has a place, oh, beautiful, has a place that you'll indicate all of your costs, and then beautiful. So this is where you would put those line items that I was talking about. So the software that you need that's there, the cost per item, how many requested, total cost, etc. But then what you'll see, Dakota, at the top of the next page is there's some questions around what you're asking. So one, is there something else that's funding your research? That's helpful for us to know. So maybe your project advisor, your research advisor has submitted a proposal that includes some of these items, or you've submitted an additional proposal. We really need to understand what parts of your project are being requested specifically for this grant, and then some items that might have been taken care of already by other funding. And then the other part, it'll ask about, does this grant fully fund your project? And if no, there's a place for you to include a little narrative so that we can try to assess, is it feasible for you to complete the project though? Let's say that the budget that you have, Dakota, is $8,000 and some really specific items. So we know that if we're only granting you a maximum of $2,000 and there's no other possible funding that you've identified, then we might come back to you and have a conversation about the feasibility of that project. So will you be able to complete the project even if you're not able to fill the entire budget? So yes, Dakota, it's very helpful that if you include the total cost of the project, which items you're specifically requesting from this grant, and then if you have other funding sources or mechanisms that you're intending to use to apply for the rest or apply to the rest of the project, that's very helpful information. If that wasn't answered well, or you have follow-up questions to that, Dakota, please just let me know. So in addition, a lot of the times there's things that WKU already provides that will support your research. So things like SPSS or a certain piece of lab equipment. So you'll just include there that the research that you're conducting, you'll be using some of the WKU specific department or college resources. So there's a place to indicate that. And then this cost sharing piece is the helpful piece for us. So if you are also receiving additional funding for your research, where does that come from? Explain that to us. And then how is that funding being used? What we try to avoid is a student submitting a project where they're getting participant incentives, that's their request, but also they've indicated that participant incentives are being covered by another funding source. So just making it as clear as possible to the committee, here's what I need, here's what I'm asking you to fund, and then here's a separate funding source and what they are covering differently than what this grant would cover. In the budget narrative section, that's going to be where you now, up top, you've got your numbers, and then here, that's where you'll develop those writing and critical thinking skills to describe the necessity of the items that you're requesting. So again, how do those items within your line item budget contribute to the completion of your project? And I know that, early on for me as a student, right, you just do the grunt work, you do research with very minimal support and funding. So it can be hard initially to think of that, but what could you potentially purchase to make your project easier, to expand the scope of your project, to diversify your sample? So try to think broadly and comprehensively about how funding could make your project easier or better. And then is this the bottom of this page? Yes, okay. Any other questions right now about funding, the budget piece? Also triple check your math. We go through the math, we add up the budget ourselves as well. So do make sure that you've gone through, maybe had someone else look at it, and just triple check the math that you do to ensure that you've added things up correctly.
Sarah, are there common things that people do incorrectly on this form?
Yes, that's a great question. So the one common one is not adding correctly. That comes up every cycle where students don't add. So we have these nice, you can see in the lighter gray, these subtotals. So in theory, you should use those to subtotal each category with which you're requesting funding, and then you would just add up those subtotals for your total budget. So that's a common mistake. And then not reviewing the fundable items. So do be sure to review the types of things that WKU says you can purchase and says you cannot purchase. And then the errors in multiplying by item. So someone might put the total cost for 12 items in the place of one item versus where it should be times 12. So just making sure that you're being really clear about how much one thing costs, how many of those things you need, and then what that total amount would be. I would say those are the three most common errors or issues that we tend to see on the budget form.
Thank
That's
you.
a good question. That's a great question about pages. So we can transition now to that narrative portion of the proposal. And so we have a question about the page requirement. We've avoided putting a page requirement on it. And that's intentional. So as a committee, we've thought a lot about, one, we are served the entire institution, right? So we have all different kinds of project proposals that come through, and there are different norms or expectations across different departments or different disciplines. And so we wanted to make sure that the requirements remained open enough to accommodate all of those differences. And then similarly, I think this is part of the skill development for students. So understanding how you can be concise, right? And include only what's critical and necessary, but comprehensive enough that you've fully described all elements is a skill, and it takes time to develop that. So for that reason, we don't have a page requirement. But I will say some errors that have happened along those lines. It shouldn't be too brief, right? So I expect that it would be greater than a couple of pages. And for that reason, again, you want to make sure that you're able to fully develop all of your ideas, especially thinking about developing your ideas for an interdisciplinary audience. So sitting on the committee, you'll have a faculty member from most of the different colleges represented. And so they all come from different disciplines, again, with different norms and different professional expertise. So in your narrative, you have to explain your very unique, very narrow idea and project to a really broad audience. So that's part of the reason for being comprehensive. But then you also should not submit your thesis proposal. We've had that happen as well, where students will just submit their entire thesis proposal document. And that, I would say, is too much. That's too excessive. And it shows that you did not take the time or develop the skill of writing to a different audience. So the way that we write up a thesis or dissertation project or an article, it's a different writing skill and a different audience than grant writing. And so for your narrative portion, again, I know students really love page limits and page numbers and requirements, and that is very helpful to us. But at this time, we haven't put a page requirement on the narrative portion. Okay, so looking a little bit now at the narrative portion and what you write up within your research proposal. Again, we'll have differences here across discipline in terms of how comprehensive some of these sections are compared to others, how many citations are used compared to others. So we certainly are sensitive to that difference that exists across fields. So of course, you'll make sure to include the project title, and then tell us about the study, the project itself. So what's the purpose of it? Describe why you're doing what you're doing. What are your research questions or your hypotheses? And then also, how will you use this study to advance knowledge in your field? There's outcomes of your project in terms of, we hope that you present at conferences and publish your work. That's an important outcome, but also thinking through what are the implications of your study for your field? How are you contributing to the literature, to the practice within your given field? And then you'll walk through the design of your study. I think the design is where students struggle most to communicate to an interdisciplinary audience. I think it's easier to talk about sort of the purpose of your study, how it's helpful to your field when communicating broadly, but really communicating your unique methods and design and maybe analyses that takes a little more work to make it so that someone from any discipline could understand it. So you'll talk about, right, what are the methods of your project, what you intend to do, the design. If you're using other instruments, whether it be you're using survey or you have approval from an organization that you're collaborating with, sort of any additional documents that are helpful in interpreting what you've written, those are really great things to include. And then describing your approach. Again, we look broadly at this. Most of the time, our projects have some sort of a statistical data analysis plan, but not always. But because, again, you can expect the committee to be broadly expert in all kinds of approaches, explaining why you've chosen that approach. So how does that relate back to those research questions? So how does it help you to answer your research questions or your hypotheses? And then how will you do that? How will you carry that out? Lastly is the portion I talked about with we hope that you all go on and publish your work and present your work and share the great work that you're doing with the larger field and community. It's really helpful for this grant, as well as for future grants you might submit for, to include specific outlets. So you should target specific conferences. So it's helpful to include the actual conference. So American Psychological Conference next August of 2022. That's my intended presentation outlet. And then 3 months following that, I hope to submit to external. So being as clear and descriptive as you can in all of these pieces of the research proposal. Questions so far on this portion? Okay, great. You'll give us some additional materials. Again, these are all very, very typical of grant submissions, and so it's good practice to get into. A one-page student bio, so typically a CV or a resume. You might have to work, depending on your field, to cut that down or format that appropriately, but a one-page student bio. You should also include a statement from you and your advisor that states to the committee that no documents within the proposal, or sorry, within the application have been plagiarized. So just an important quick little note statement of plagiarism that the research chair, research advisor has reviewed the documents as well, and that no documents included within the application have been plagiarized. You could also put on that same paper the letter of endorsement from your advisor. So what we've seen in the past, a lot of the times, research advisors or chairs will write their letter in support of the student project. This letter might include things like your capacity, the resources you have within department, some of your previous work that suggests you have the ability and support necessary to complete the project. And then a lot of times the research advisor will just include a statement of plagiarism at the bottom of their letter as well. But there needs to be a place for the student and the professor both certify no documents have been plagiarized, as well as a letter of endorsement from your research chair or research advisor. The other thing that we look at is cooperation. So if you are proposing that you're going to work with Mammoth Cave to go collect samples, we would want some documentation or support that you've already had that conversation with someone at Mammoth Cave and that's been approved or supported, just to ensure that that is a step, a part of the project that will be able to carry out. Relatedly, you should include your IRB or IACUC letter. So if you are doing research with human subjects or with animals, then that requires approval, then you would include that approval letter with your application as well. I still work up to deadlines. I understand, students, that we are constantly working up until the last deadline, but do be sure that you adhere to deadlines. So if you turn in an application last minute, but you make the deadline, but you didn't have all of the components there, your application won't be reviewed and will encourage you to submit on the next cycle. And depending on your research needs and your timeline, that might be problematic for you. So do try to plan ahead. The call, fortunately, has been out for a little while. You still have plenty of time until October 11th. So work, if you intend to submit something, I would make your research advisor and at least your department head aware of that at this time, if not also your college representative. Because again, you need all of those signatures on that form and in your application to be considered complete. And so it's courteous to notify those individuals with as much advance warning that you'll be requiring their review and their signatures. And then again, all of those materials will be submitted to GS Research Grant at wku.edu. The Graduate Student Research Grant at wku.edu. Questions still? We're doing okay? All right. So this is really helpful guidance from the Graduate School about fundable expenses. I will note, which I did not note earlier, that this year, and Dr. Kudali can chime in and correct me if I'm wrong, but this year we are also allowing for conference travel. So if you are presenting your work at a conference, you can include that as an expense that's allowable, because we don't have a separate graduate student travel grant available this year. And so you can use funds from the Graduate Student Research Grant to support your travel to present research at conferences. And for that, of course, you would have to be sure that you have included the acceptance of your presentation, and then all of those details about registration, accommodation, and travel, et cetera. So from these fundable expenses, let me see if anything sticks out. The coding piece, so if we have qualitative studies that come through, it's pretty common for students to request funding to support transcription, coding services of some sort. Again, for field-based travel, we have students that might be traveling to Barren River Lake to collect samples, to Mammoth Cave to collect samples, to Kentucky Museum to analyze certain, or another museum to analyze certain artifacts. So travel is a common one. Again, participant incentives are pretty common. And the other thing I'll note here, I know it was on the first slide, but I just want to be sure to say that your funds need to be spent within the year. So just to remember, yeah, so all funding accounts are closed prior to graduation. So you have a year to use the funds, and then they have to be closed out before you graduate. So again, just plan ahead a little bit to try to find that sweet spot of when you should apply based on when you need the funds. And I will say we tend to be pretty quick and responsive in terms of funding decisions after the committee meets to review all of the documents, complete the evaluations. We get that information to the graduate school, and the graduate school sends you the outcome of your project proposal pretty quickly, which is, I think, helpful to students to be able to keep moving forward quickly in their research.
I'll add just one thing to the students. We do have a lot of conferences held virtually, so you could fundable expenses include registration for virtual conferences as well. So that is an opportunity for you to showcase your research and share your research with your peers in the community. And this way it brings recognition. It's an experience for you. It also brings recognition to WKU. So in-person and or virtual conferences will be supported. But please do note that we have to abide by the WKU Healthy on the Hill guidelines for travel. So please follow the travel guidelines as indicated in our university website, and CDC guidelines as well. So we just ask you to be mindful of those when you're traveling to some hotspots, especially.
I appreciate that. So these are just some general sort of tips, things to be thinking about. Try to avoid as much jargon as you can. So we have alluded to this already, but within our disciplines, we all know that we have a lot of acronyms and discipline-specific language. So I think that's one of the greatest sort of gifts and skills of this process, because while we are all passionate about our field and moving our discipline forward, I think being able to communicate to the broader community and audience that what your work is and why it matters is a really important skill. So you might consider having someone, one of your peers from another discipline, maybe a undergrad college friend from back home, read your proposal, maybe someone from your family who doesn't have a research background. So try to see if, test it out on a number of people, and try to see if people outside of your specific discipline understand what you're trying to accomplish and how you're trying to go about doing that. There's some questions on here that you might consider that are helpful in that. So things like what is the gap in knowledge, right, that you're trying to fill or bridge. Explaining new knowledge, contributions expected. You all can read most of this, but I'll highlight a few of them. Hopefully you're seeing that the theme is that you'll have an interdisciplinary audience, and you should write in a way that a generalist can understand. So yes, we all have research foundations and are researchers and scholars, but tend to be pretty discipline specific and may not have a broad expertise across the types of projects being done across the university. Other questions so far? Certainly you want to review for just general writing errors, right? So again, that's where anybody would be helpful to you in that process. Just looking at grammar, typos. Dakota, what is your, you're welcome to try to type it in the chat and see if it's something that we can, if you're comfortable doing that we could answer and address. But if you'd be more comfortable, you could start by emailing me, I guess. I can put my email in the chat, whichever you're comfortable with, Dakota. Okay. We're fortunate to have this amount. Dr. Kudali and the graduate school have done an exceptional job at advocating for student research. I think it's a real privilege that we have these funds available for students, and I think it shows that WKU really does value and prioritize student work, and we're excited about developing students as future scholars. So your applications are limited to $2,000. Again, to the point that was brought up earlier, your project may cost in excess of $2,000, but we will fund up to $2,000. There's some specific purchasing policy, which you of course should review ahead of time, but certainly will be reviewing throughout making purchases. It's atypical that we have a student apply for more than one grant, but it's possible. Most of the time, students are applying for these funds for their capstone thesis, dissertation project, but it doesn't have to be used for that. So it's certainly possible that you could apply for up to 2 grants for the course of your degree, but that would be no more than those $2,000. So let's say if you submitted a grant a year ago for $500 for participant incentives, you could then this year, next year, submit another grant for $1,000 for a new budget item that you have. So let me, unless there's a slide that talks about it, which I should know and remember, I'm going to talk a little bit about Yeah, on the next slide, I guess I will talk, I'll talk here about what happens, what the process is. So we've already said GS research grant at wku.edu, GS research grant at wku.edu. So you'll remember that email address. So just before this happens, so after you submit your materials, the graduate school is wonderful and compiles those for us, for the committee, puts them in a great, easy to read format. And then, so an interdisciplinary committee of, currently our committee has 4 graduate faculty and 2 graduate students sit on our committee as well. And so we review grants, we'll go through, read all of the application materials, provide feedback. We have a rubric that we use that really looks at those elements of the application. So for your budget, is it economical, but also critical for your work? Is it an appropriate budget? Does it seem like it would allow for you to conduct the project that you're describing? We look at the purpose of your study. So did you describe the significance of your project? And does it represent a significant contribution to your field or to moving the work forward? And all of those elements. So we go through and we'll complete rubric, and then we meet and talk as a committee. So if there's any discrepancies that we have in our completion of those evaluations, or if there's questions that come up. So if a question comes up, we might reach out to the student or to the research chair, but we meet as a committee, compile our rubric scores, our evaluations, and then if there's no concerns, we write up our funding recommendations and we submit those to the graduate school. And then that brings us here to number 2. So after that, the graduate school will reach out with their final recommendation and let you know about the funding decision for your application. I will talk a little bit about this, but I don't typically deal with the back end quite as much, but certainly be patient and compassionate, right, with the graduate school in terms of actually releasing the funds to you. So it takes them a little bit. There's a little bit of paperwork involved to set up an account for you, some things that you'll sign, and then you will be able to access those funds and start purchasing items required for your research. And then within that letter, you'll get a letter that talks about that initial contract date, and then sort of the final contract that you'll complete, that you'll talk about what the funds were actually spent on and submit that. I don't know if either Ms. Birchfield or Dr. Crudali have anything they want to add on the post-award process at all.
No, it's much foreign to me now. I'll learn in the next few weeks, Dr. Oakes. Shonda was doing most of the work, and so it'll be an interesting dynamic in the coming weeks. But we'll take care. This is supporting students is critical to us, but we'll ensure that we'll try to have a quick turnaround so that the funds are released and the students can actually start working. So,
Great.
Absolutely.
Thank you. All right.
Is there anything in this slide you would like to?
Gertrude, I'll come right back to your question in one moment. Oh yes, so this is a great, I'm glad you have this. Sometimes we have students who are completing collaborative projects, which is wonderful and exciting. So if you are submitting a grant proposal for a collaborative project, you have a couple of different options. So you can submit a joint application for up to those $2,000, or if you have sufficient need, each student can submit an application if in there you describe very clearly and specifically what each student is contributing to the project, their role in the research project. Then you could submit 2 individual applications that would be up to $2,000 per student submitting an application. It doesn't happen often, but we do occasionally have a collaborative proposal that's submitted. certainly we try to prioritize those who have not previously received funding as we're making our funding decisions. And then it goes without saying, but I'll say it. Any funding, anything that you have spent previously to contribute to your project, we don't reimburse for that. So it would be whenever following the award, you could spend your funds on any new materials, but no reimbursement. And this is a good, the second to last bullet is also a good point. I think students, again, it's a new process for a lot of you. So when you hopefully go on to publish your work, there's typically like a funding disclosure. And so you should acknowledge within there that the amount and that funds from the WKU Graduate Student Research Grant were used to support the completion of the project. It's important to disclose that. And this last bullet, again, we've alluded to already, but it is a process. It's a skill that takes time to develop. It's a different type of writing. It's a different type of thinking. You're sort of selling your project now and why it should be funded. And so do give yourself ample time to really marinate on that and think through that and develop a comprehensive proposal that is descriptive enough for, again, a broad audience to be able to read, understand, and make decisions about. And also, again, give your research advisor sufficient time to review and to provide you feedback as well. All right, let me go to Gertrude's question for a moment. So would it be possible to be funded for collecting data from a project and attend the conference during the same year? The short answer is yes, that's ideal. So that would be perfect, right? Because your funds have to be used. You have a year to use them. Sometimes what happens is that often, right, we have to submit proposals for conferences 6-8 months in advance. So it can mess up your timeline a little bit, but if you're able to do that to where you can collect data and present in a conference in the same calendar year, that's ideal, and all of those items should go within your research proposal. If I misunderstood or answered that insufficiently, please let me know. Okay. So this is this slide details the information that we said we're going to learn and find out and do really well for you, but have not historically been involved with in the past. But you will certainly get lots of appropriate communication from the graduate school following the decision about funding. So you'll get an initial letter of approval that will tell you all the details you need to know about how you access funds, the dates, allowable expenses, all of that good stuff. And then you'll submit an initial contract prior to receiving your funds, everything signed, dated, etc. Funds get transferred, and then you'll submit another final contract that describes how you spent your funds. So there's our final contract. So again, you will be responsible, right, for describing how the funds were spent. So you'll, within your initial application, you will write a draft proposal in your budget for how you will spend your funds, but then that final contract really details exactly how you did spend those funds. Now you all have memorized GS Research Grant at wku.edu. What other questions do you have about the process or the review process or the writing process or resources available that we might answer that could be helpful to you?
I think you were incredibly thorough, Dr. Oakes.
That's good. Based on your participation today, I'm assuming many of you are intending to submit something for this October 11th deadline. Is that accurate? You can write in the chat if you don't want to smile and nod, but are most people intending on submitting something for this October 11th deadline? Goody, goody.
Laura, can you have the second poll regarding the discipline just to get a sense?
I was just about to ask the same thing. I'm going to launch it right now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Oakes.
That's great, Ashley. Maybe you learned some things today about sort of timeline and when you'll need funding, and making a more intentional decision about spring probably fits you best. All right, so we have some representation across several of our colleges. It's typical for us to get a high number of submissions from Ogden, but again, we see submissions across the entire university, and I think just because it's not my expertise, but we certainly are open and interested in funding all sorts of creative projects that students are doing that might not fall under the most traditional science research project type. But any student work that's being done, we want to be able to think through and support for you. Any additional questions that we can answer for you? I'm going to ask you another question then for a few minutes. You can just say another yes or no if you want, but did you learn something today? Like, as a result of attending this presentation, do you feel like you either feel more prepared to submit a grant, or you understand the logistics better? What's something that you actually learned or took away that you didn't have when you came here today? Well, I feel good. I know at least I helped at least 2 people, right?
Question, Dr. Oakes, about the page count. Do you suggest, I know we said we don't have a limit, but from your experience, is there a sweet spot? You found 3 or 5 pages. I know it depends on the discipline, but what would you suggest to someone who's new?
It's a good question. I do think right around that 3 to 5 page is a nice range. Again, if you only have a page or 2, that's just really not enough content for someone who's not an expert in your field to understand sufficiently. But when you get into this like 10-page range, you're probably adding in a little more fluff and unnecessary information. So I do think that 3 to 5 page range is where a lot of students end up sitting and is most helpful.
Do you have any guidance about font size? You don't want to cram in 3 pages and 8 font size as well, right? And the use of figures and graphs, sometimes a picture speaks 1,000 words. Any guidance on that, Dr. Oakes?
I would defer to your discipline and sort of what those norms are. Again, there's some of our hard sciences that we see a lot of graphs and figures, and I think that's pretty typical. Of course, you'll want to make sure those are labeled and described, right, even though they're included. Mm-hmm. And then in terms of the same thing, in psychology, right, we always use 12-point font, Times New Roman, double space. So that's kind of our standard recommendation, but whatever is typical of your discipline and looks presentable and is easy to read. So I think if you start putting in graphs, figures, fonts that make it difficult for someone to read and take in, then I would change it. But otherwise, whatever is typical of your discipline is fine.
Ariana, was your question answered by Dr. Oakes? Page. Wonderful. I'm looking for any other questions.
In
We
terms
will
of
post,
accessing, yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
we will post this recording and also this PowerPoint attachment. Laura, once the Zoom recording is processed, we will have this in our YouTube channel pretty soon. And also the PowerPoint presentation will be sent by Constant Contact as well. So we'll share these resources. Absolutely.
And I'll put my email in the chat again. If you have any questions as you're working on things that I can be helpful on, I'm happy to do that. I never know if these are helpful and hit to what you all need. So I genuinely appreciate the feedback that you all are giving in the chat. And related to that, if there's things that we didn't talk about that you, well, one, you're welcome to ask us, but if not, please let us know that so that we can continue to refine these over time to do what's most helpful to our students. Great.
Any other questions from the students? And please do inform your friends as well. You know, the PowerPoint presentation and the recording will be shared. And we're always here to help you. I know some of the students may have had conflict in their schedules with their teaching or serving as a graduate teaching assistant, and that is unavoidable despite our best efforts. So we'll be glad to help them as well. Dr. Oakes, you want to close by some final remarks?
I would just thank you all for being here and for making time to think about and prioritize your development as scholars. I think it's a skill that will serve you well wherever you go, whatever you go on to do. So I just encourage you to sort of pat yourselves on the back and give yourselves due credit for the work that you're interested in putting in to understand this process and to complete this process and to better yourselves as people and as professionals. So thank you for your investment in that.
Well said, and the same. And thank you for your time, Dr. Oakes. It's been phenomenal, even from someone who's worked in the grad school, maybe not quite on the research side of things. That was very informative. And thank you, Dr. Kidali, for orchestrating all of this with us. So
thank you all very much. I will share the YouTube links and the presentation as well. Thank you for joining with us this afternoon. Bye-bye.